Hello, everyone. I hope you're all doing very well. Today, I'm joined with Juraj from QuikBuild, right? Is that how you would?
Yeah,
Yeah. So
you
web
pronounced it correctly.
is
Yeah.
specialized in no code, but you're going to tell us a little bit more about you in a second. Feel free to say hi in the chat. Would love to know where you're based. I'm based in France myself. How about you?
I'm based in Bratislava, Slovakia. So
Slovakia.
yeah, we have the
Nice.
base of the team in Slovakia and the rest across Europe.
Very cool. All right. And so today, Yura is going to share with us his experience in developing programming with and without code, like basically translating the learnings from traditional coders to no code. So if you have any questions, hi Antoine from France as well, Bayonne, that's the south of France. So you must have very nice weather right now. And all right, I'll let you share your screen and get started. So let me show you a screen so
Mhm.
everyone can see it. And there we go.
Cool. So thank you, Juraj, for a quick intro, and hello everyone. I guess depending on where you are, good morning, good evening, or good afternoon. So yeah, thanks for today's invitation. So basically, as you started the topic today, will be like how to create more scalable, more secure and faster applications. Because let me start with some like intro disclaimer. Like the no code development itself is great because it allows non-technical people to create applications, right? Either it be mobile or web applications. So that's a great upside. So what's a downside of it is that when you are developing applications, no code tools such as VWeb or other tools will not solve every aspect of the development process for you. Yeah. So, for example, performance related stuff or security stuff. So, people without a technical background might miss some core or basic concepts when building the application. And this will be the focus of today's presentation, but I will want to cover three topics: database, security, and what I would call how to avoid a spaghetti code or spaghetti no code, especially in in VWeb. So as you can see from the first slide, the presentation will be less of a McKinsey style presentation with super fancy charts, etc., and it will be more about no code memes. So before I will jump into the topic, let me start with a brief intro about me and about QuikBuild. So what we are doing in QuikBuild, which I'm a founder of, we are building web and mobile applications with uh, one of the most loved tools that we love is especially VWeb, but we work with the tools such as Xana, Flutterflow, or Supabase. So at the beginning of like my no code journey, it was like 5 years ago. I started with Bubble, as a lot of no code developers, but we continuously switched to a different tech stack that fits us better. So that's why we love working with VWeb as a front end no code builder.
Yeah,
And
I'm sure there are other people in the chat with a similar background. Or and if you're new to no code, feel free to also ask your questions about. I mean, I'm sure at some point we can discuss later in the presentation, maybe during the Q&A, like what brought you to choose such tools.
mhm.
I think when we talk about database design, for sure, it will make sense to talk about Xano and Supabase as well, and the strength, the flexibility, and the power they give you.
Yeah, definitely. And especially like when we like work with bigger clients like enterprises, it's especially important to be aware of these tech knowledge and especially security. So that's why I want to like cover like these three topics. So let me start with the first like area or first pillar, which is the database design. So I will try to start what can actually go wrong if you will not implement the proper database design. So you can have a slow application, you can have inconsistent data, you can have some data breaches, and for example, it might be in the later stage more difficult to create new features if you don't have a proper database structure. So let me start with like a basic example of what's like one of the most important concepts in database modeling, which is data normalization. So what is the table that we are looking at is like a simple table with list of products. Product has some brand, and product it was supposed to be category, and product has a company. Yeah. So this is what is called a denormalized data. So you basically put all the information in one table. Yeah. And let me explain why this approach is actually a problem. So there are a few things to mention. So first of all is that if you are storing it only as a, for example, a string like a company name or a category name, you can store only one information instead of multiple information about, for example, category or about the company. Or if you are changing the data, you need to make a lot of changes instead of one change in the front table. And you are actually in high risk to be inconsistent with the data that you have. So this is like the first, or I would say the main thing that we sometimes encounter when we work with someone who already has an application but didn't had the didn't catch the basics of the database modeling. And the question is how to actually make it proper in terms of database modeling. You have a table product, you have product category, and you have product company. So this
And I
is
think
an example.
that's something that, like in the WeWeb Academy, we talk a lot about in level 2 of the academy, especially. And I think
Mhm.
what's because in theory you could update, you could have a column with like company and have a JSON object in there with lots of information. But like you said, then there's a high risk of mistake when you update that JSON. It's just not easy to read. Whereas once
Exactly.
if you have one table per big category of information, you have much more control and granularity over which information you fetch, so you don't have to fetch everything all the time. And I think in the example you're showing here, if for example there was a typo in the category name, instead of notebooks we wanted to call it notebook, and or put everything singular, we only need to change it once,
Exactly.
and it's updated for all the related fields, which saves a lot of time. And like you said, as soon as the like for maintenance, as soon as the app begins growing, it's helpful.
Yeah. And like this example that I provided is just a super simple example. Now we can all imagine what will happen if you like if you have a much more complex database, and this will happen which with much more complex database system or much more entities within the database. So exactly as you mentioned, there are other ways, for example, starting as JSON, but you have a quite risk. And what is one thing to mention about these data normalization versus data denormalization? You always need to like find balance. So you can implement like absolutely denormalized data, which was the first slide that I showed, but sometimes you can over engineer to like create tables for everything, and sometimes it gives you a less value. So you need to always find like a balance between the data normalization and the denormalization.
And I think if you're just getting started, it's important to realize that it's going to take a little bit of time to find the right balance for you. So it's,
Exactly.
it's the same when, like, when you use global workflows versus, simple workflows, or variables that are scoped inside a component versus outside a component. Like, all these things take a little bit of time and practice to get a feel for it, because like you said at the beginning, it's like a no-code developer is still a developer. It's still like a real job with real
Yes.
skills that you have to learn, and it takes time to master those skills. So I think it's important. That's why I'm really happy you're here to tell us about this, because it's the kind of concepts that can be scary at the beginning, but just keep in mind that you don't have to get everything right at the beginning. It's when you notice that you're repeating yourself, that you're copy pasting things, that you make mistakes, that you're getting all the data, even data you don't need, that's a sign that there's probably something you can optimize.
Yes. And if I would to give a one tip, like for people who have like zero experience with database modeling, it would be like use ChatGPT. Like describe your use case, describe your scenario, and more often than not, it will give you a good answer like how you should structure the database. So if you are really not sure how to structure your database and you want to skip like tens of hours of learning database modeling, try to ask ChatGPT and you probably get the right answer. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would also suggest like asking more experienced developers, like
Or
to
that's
fact.
even better alternative.
But
If
no,
you
but
have a chance to
to get
ask.
started, yeah, of course. But like, I'm thinking in Xano or Supabase's community forums, or even our community forum, we get the question quite regularly, and I
Mhm.
think like ChatGPT is a great way to get started, and then you give it a try, and once you scale, like, don't hesitate. I think the no code community is amazing for that. There are so many great people who are, like, it's same as the traditional coda culture. There's really a culture of sharing and helping each other out, which I think is like great to leverage. You're going to struggle to improve without talking to other people who are also building.
With that, I like definitely agree. Like either if you have someone within the team, or exactly as you mentioned, like I know the community is smaller, like the Stack Overflow, for example, but it's still big enough to with a bunch of people who are actually willing to help you solve the problem.
And actually, in theory, you could also ask about database design and Stack Overflow. Like, it's
That's
you,
right, because
we
it's not
might
like
not
no code
just,
specific.
yeah. And Antoine is saying perfect to have, yeah, ChatGPT is absolutely perfect to have a first draft idea to get the database schema.
Yeah, exactly.
Hi, Roberto. Roberto just joined us. And just for the
I
little anecdote, Roberto is actually the one who put us in touch. So thanks for the introduction, bro.
Yeah, thanks. And actually, he's one of the, I think, most active members of the community. So if you will need help with
Yeah,
some of your
true.
web problem, it's like a high chance that you will get an answer from Roberto.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah. Cool. So let's continue. So the first topic was about like making the data consistent, right? So the second one is like keep it fast. What does it mean? Like if we are if we are talking about like keeping the data fast enough, like what's usually the number one that you would get a recommendation for, and that's index your tables. There is a disclaimer like it makes sense only if you are working with a lot of data. So if you have a data of, let's say, like tens of records, hundreds or records, or even thousands of records, it might not be efficient, because like most probably you will not have problems with queries and the time to like query the data. But once you start working with data, which is like of range millions or hundreds of thousands of records or even more, then you might have a problem with the query time. So let's say you have a social network, you want to query all the all the posts from user. So let's say you have a big social network and you have like millions of records, then actually it can improve like how fast you get the data by factor of like 10, 100, or even 1,000. So like there are queries which might take normally without indexing like approximately minutes or even hours, but actually with database indexing it might take seconds. And what
And
I would mention, one thing is like usually, Joyce, you can confirm if I'm not mistaken, but most of the web users work with either Xana or Supabase. And for both of these, you have an ability to set up your own index for the database.
cool. And I like the fact that you mentioned that it's maybe not something you need to worry about right from the start. Because again, it comes
Yeah.
back to that everything we're going to talk about today. I mean, they're important programming concepts that you should keep in mind, but also you shouldn't like it shouldn't stop you from getting started. It's not because you don't know all of this that you can't get started. I'm curious as to when would you know, like what would be a signal that you need to look into database indexing? Is it like
Mhm.
when you see something is taking like 4 seconds to come in, when you're fetching data it's taking a long time? When would you start looking at that?
Okay, so I will try to give you a different answer because like I think it's difficult to generalize to number of seconds because it might be a different use case. Like there are use cases when it's like expected that something will take 5 seconds, 10 seconds or
Yeah.
something. Um, I would say if it's interrupting the user experience, then you should start, or if the slow queries are interrupting user experience, then I think it's a good point to start looking at improving the performance of the database. So let's use this example of social network. So if you open someone's profile and you want to see their posts, you don't want to wait like 5 or 10 seconds. So in this case, yes, you should have a look at the database indexing. But let's say you have a second example. You have some pre-calculated reports for the users.
Mhm.
Yeah, so reports which are pre-calculated every hour or something. It's not a problem if those queries take 10 seconds or even 1 minute because it's pre-calculated. So the answer
When the
is
user expects, when they ask for a report, they know it's
exactly,
gonna, yeah.
exactly. So this is something like a starting point that I would start to look at. To
And
put it in technical jargon, we could say like depends on if you expect data synchronously or asynchronously.
okay.
So it depends.
And Prince is asking a related question like when would you switch to Algolia or Elasticsearch at the expense of indexes?
Okay. So actually, we had one project when I was exploring Algolia. It was mainly for AI search. So let me give you an example. Xana is great. It allows to implement like searching based on like the string. For example, if like some property contains some information or some substring or something like that. They also have a fuzzy search functionality when you want to search across a bigger pieces of text, for example. But the use case I was looking at was about the text similarity. So, if, for example, if you have a lot of records and you want to do an advanced so called fuzzy search, that is, for example, the use case when we were exploring the Algolia. And second example would be, especially if you are working with unstructured data and a lot of unstructured data. So this would be probably two use cases which comes to my mind. But if someone has, like from their experience, some other interesting use case, happy to hear about it.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Prince, for your question.
Cool. So the last one to close the database part is database triggers. We can spend a lot of time describing the use cases when to use them, but let me be brief and say it allows you to be more consistent of how you are working with your data. One example, audit logging. So we had a project when the client wanted to log every data operation that the user was doing. So if user was creating new data records, I wanted to have an audit log about that. If user was editing some records, again, same story. So without database triggers, you would need to implement like a say custom logic. Okay, when the new record is created, the API endpoint for new record is executed, create a new audit log. When data is being changed, again, by listening to API endpoint, create new audit log record. So instead, if you use database triggers, so database triggers are basically, they allow you to do some action every time when there is a change in the database, new record or updated record, or the record is deleted. So there are plenty of use cases how to use database triggers, but the main point is if you want to avoid, let's say, doing doing the same stuff multiple times, I would definitely use database triggers. Again, Xano, Supabase, both supports database triggers, so I would definitely use those. Cool. So this is not a topic. This is just one example that I really wanted to show. I was looking for the screenshot within my Slack conversations for like 20 minutes. You probably know that this is not a WeWeb. I don't have to say like which no-code tool it is, but we had a client that had an application in other no-code platform. And what we were quite surprised when we find out is that their use case was that they had an application in I think 15 different languages or something, and the way how a previous agency or freelancer, and I'm not sure, implemented those translations was that they have created almost 1,000 database fields. This is some, I would say, a big no-go that I saw within my no-code career. So this was just a perk to show you like what can go wrong in an actual project if you really mess up with the database modeling.
So how did you, actually, it's just quickly, how would you handle that use case
So we
properly?
actually
Like,
needed to handle the
it's
situation that,
in more scalable way.
yeah, so we created a separate table where each translation, where each combination of text and the translation of the translation text and the language was a separate record. So in this way, you don't need to create a new columns for each translation, each language, and it allows you to work much better with those translations.
You can
Uh,
filter more easily.
exactly. Don't ask me why we didn't implement the native functionality of this no-code platform, which also supports the translation. It wasn't this use case, so
Yeah.
if you would want to implement it in a proper way, use the database with multiple records.
And Ryan is asking, when building multiple internal apps, is it best to have a single workspace or separate for each app? There will be some overlap in tables like locations and employees, but everything else will be unique. So I'm not sure if you mean like a web workspace or if you mean like a database when you say workspace. Um,
Mm, maybe I guess if we are talking about databases, my guess is that the question is more related to
yeah,
backend, but I'm not sure. So, um, of course, it depends. So, question number one would be, or I would have two main questions. So, number one would be user authentication. So, these different internal applications, do they share the user authentication? So that's probably the question number one. So, for example, if in Xana workspaces, you cannot have like one user authentication for two different workspaces. So that's
even instances. I think it's per instance, right? Because there's your workspace and your Xano instance.
yeah. So you have an instance and you can have multiple workspaces,
Yeah.
and of course, like you
Oh yeah,
can
it's the opposite.
communicate between those workspaces by API requests, but you cannot share a lot of things between those workspaces. So that would be question number one. Question number two: how much of the data are being shared? But if if you would want to have the same user authentication, it might be complicated to implement it in a way that you have different workspaces. So again,
And,
it depends on the use case.
and I think as well, I mean, I don't know the use case, but if you have overlap between tables, like for me, one of the things that I remember from database design is to avoid duplicating the data. So if you have an overlap between tables, I mean, in theory, ideally, you only want the data in one place. So it would, yeah, I would instinctively, but like you said, I'm sure there are exceptions, and it kind of depends on your use case. But instinctively, I think in most cases, you would probably want, you know, the same workspace, basically. I mean, one database, really.
Yeah,
Or
I
no, I
mean,
guess yeah,
it
you can
might
do.
be like again, depending on the scenario, it might be that you have like a workspace. Let's call it master data workspace, where you have all
Yeah.
the shared data entities,
Okay.
and then you have a separate entities or separate data for different applications.
Yeah, for like business units or something like that.
Exactly, exactly.
Makes sense. Cool.
So it might
Thanks.
be
I
this
hope that
case.
helped, Ryan.
Um, okay, so application security topic number two. And the question of what can go wrong is that we could spend probably like 2-3 hours discussing what can go wrong actually if you do not handle security correctly. So
Yeah, and actually, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm just gonna because for most of these things, I always say you can worry about it later as as you don't worry if you don't know everything. For security, the earlier you start worrying about it, the better, because that
exactly.
can even if you're just at the MVP stage, if you have a security breach, that it's a problem.
And if someone already knows from the screenshot what is wrong with the image on the right side, feel free to comment it. I will have a separate slide for it at the end of this application security part. But actually, yes, you're right. So this isn't something that you need to worry about once you will scale, because like having the data, not only the data security, but in general, having a secure application is important from day one. It's especially important if you are building a customer facing application, right? Because like if you are building internal application, I guess there are less risks than customer facing, but still you need to handle the security correctly. You can lose the data, expose the sensitive data, you can lose the money, users can lose the money, so a lot of bad things can happen. And there are plenty of concepts about the security. I will focus only on like two or three of them which I encounter quite often when I see some application built by someone else, for example. But before that, short pop quiz. So let's say we have this scenario, and I want you to guess like what's wrong. Yeah? So we have a user table. You see it on the left side. You have the username, you have the email, you have the password. You have IDs, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's number one. Number two, you have an API endpoint. Let's say that this API endpoint is for users to update their own profile. So if I want to update my email or my first name, last name, I will just call this API. Um, I will implement it in a way that user ID is provided as an input, and then the data is being changed. Nothing else. So if anyone knows what is actually wrong with this setup, leave a comment in YouTube, and let's see in a few minutes.
Nice.
Uh, so as I mentioned, there are a lot of topics that we could cover for the security, but the most important one, and it's not like a specific security topic, it is something that developers, no-code developers, should be aware about. And that is what's happening like on the client side, which is the browser. So what is happening on the browser and what's happening behind the curtain, so on the server. And I, Joyce, maybe if you can remind me, if I remember correctly, you had either a community post or video on YouTube
Yeah,
where you also focused on this topic.
I didn't want to interrupt, but I'm sharing the link to the video in the comments because here we're gonna cover the basics. If you want to dig deeper, you can check out the video. But yeah, we talk a lot about the difference between when you don't see the data. It doesn't mean that it's not accessible. It may already
Exactly.
be in your browser, or it may be easily accessible if you make the API call yourself, basically. So.
Yes, and as the meme suggests, like hiding the data on the front end will not solve the problem.
Which Antoine
Um,
says, love this meme.
so what can actually like two examples which you already like started with is like the one is exposing sensitive data. So what can it be? For example, like secret tokens. Like you have these, let's call it secret tokens, integration tokens, etc. Tokens which are supposed to be on your backend, which you never should use in a browser on the front end. In this case, in the web. So it's like, for example, Stripe. If you are integrating Stripe, you have this public token and you have secret token. Public token is used for their SDK or for browser calls. But if you, for example, want to do some direct API calls to Stripe API, and you will put a Stripe secret key into the web, into the web accessible to the users if they will open the console. Well, this is a huge breach because if someone has an access to your Stripe account, they can do a lot of things that you don't want to happen. So
And I just share because the confusion between like public keys and private keys and secret tokens can be. I know I still get confused, so I shared in the comments an article that Q wrote for a blog that explains that because there are some tokens that are public, they are meant to be public, so
yes,
you don't need to stress about that. Like very often we get the question like, my Stripe token is visible in WeWeb, and it's like, yeah, it's fine, it's the public, it's a public token that's meant to be there. So there's a big difference between the two. I often still get
mhm.
confused. I see Roberto in the comments said, "God, how many setups I saw doing this!" Like, and I mean, it's not just no coders; it's also traditional coders. When you're first starting out, it's like a classic mistake. So, yeah, the sooner
Exactly.
you learn about that, the better. And by the way, Damien and Roberto answered for the previous question
Okay,
about the Stripe.
I guess they answered correctly. We will see.
Yes, they did. They did.
Okay. Uh,
should I share the answer, or do you
we
did
have,
you?
I will have an answer in
All
like
right,
2 minutes in
perfect.
the
All right.
next slides. So, and the use case number two, just to be super quick, is exactly like if user doesn't see the data, it doesn't mean user cannot access the data. So seeing the data and accessing the data, two different things. So a scenario where you will just hide the data that the user should not see doesn't mean that he cannot access them, because he can or she can open the browser console and they can see what's actually received from the API endpoint. So if the data is there, user can access them. So
Yeah.
that's like the
To
second
give
use
a couple of
case.
examples, this is usually when you use the CSS display none fe-
Hmm.
option. That doesn't mean that the data, the data is still accessible in the browser. It also happens if you add a filter, a front end filter. So if you're not filtering the data, if the server is returning data and then you're filtering, even if it's not displayed on the page, it's still visible inside. It was still downloaded in your user's browser. So
Exactly. Exactly. So okay, so da da da. What's wrong actually with this is, okay, I cannot see the answer in YouTube. I don't have it right now. But basically, if you have an API endpoint, and the only thing that you use to actually identify the user is the input for that API, it's like I can, with my authentication token, I am a user, I can forge the API request to change someone else's data, because there is no check if the person actually calling the API call does have an access or can actually do the action. So that's why it's important to like identify the user with the authentication token, not with the ID as an input. So were those answers correct, Joyce?
yes, they were.
Okay,
I would have
nice.
been very worried if Damon and Roberto had got it wrong.
Yeah, yeah. So we can always rely on them. Uh, nice.
For context,
So
both are developers, and experienced developers. So that's why I'm saying that. Otherwise, it's a completely honest mistake if you're just
yes,
getting started.
exactly. And don't want to deep dive into those three topics, but three things which are, if you also Google like the most common web applications vulnerabilities, you get like some of these, like SQL injections. It is basically that someone will alter the query that you are doing on your backend. Or the XSS attack is basically, let's say you have some community forum or something like that implemented, and someone will create a post or comment or something which is basically a script. So if you do not sanitize the input or the text field or something, that script can be actually executed in your browser just by loading the page. So actually, if I'm not mistaken, yeah, WebVivo supports the
Yeah,
sanitization of the inputs. So just keep this in mind to sanitize the inputs and text fields for everything which is user generated, comments, posts, or anything that comes from your user base. And the last one, storing passwords as plain text. Again, it's a heavy no go. So actually, how it's handled usually, mm, I think that Xana solves this out of the box. I think also
yeah,
Supabase.
both do them.
Uh, so you don't need to store passwords as a plain text. Actually, there is some. It's converted to so-called hash, and there is some salt added to the hash. So this is usually the best practice how to store passwords. So it's the same for tokens. If you don't need the plain text tokens, for example, for user integrations, etc., do not store like basically the sensitive data for which you don't need to know an exact value, because
And
you just need to check if the value is correct, but you don't need to know the value.
yeah, and I was just thinking as you were saying this, I think the hashing of passwords is a really good example of how no-code tools simplify your life so much, save you so much time because it's just out of the box. You know, Xano and Supabase receive the user's password, and they just, if it's in a password field, you know, they'll just they handle that automatically for you, which is kind of amazing. I had
Exactly.
never realized, but I don't know how to do it in traditional code, but I'm assuming it's not, you know, it's a few lines.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you have always a lot of libraries to implement
Mm,
those either security policies or those mechanisms, but you need to know that you need to implement it. Like, it will not
true.
be solved for you. And like, coming back to the beginning where I like said, no code is great because it allows non-technical people. On the other hand, non-technical people might miss some basic concepts about the security and database, etc.
Mm,
But exactly as you mentioned, it's created a lot of no-code platforms try to abstract away from this. So it will solve it out of the box, or at least some of them, some of those
yeah.
things.
Yeah.
And I see that for this slide, I do not have a correct meme, so ignore this one. Uh,
Oh, we're disappointed. I was looking forward to a new meme.
no, sorry, next time. But the last part is the company that I used to work for was that their motto was to avoid the spaghetti code or spaghetti code. And what it actually means, I will try to explain. But in other words, it's a messy front end, it's a messy backend. So if you do not use the modular approach, if you do not use the components, if you do not have the proper naming convention, etc., etc., it's what I would call a spaghetti, in this case, no code. And again, why is it important to have this in mind? So, number one, you don't want to screw up the user experience by having a lot of bugs. And the spaghetti no code can actually introduce a lot of bugs. The second important thing is that everyone who already spent some time doing the development definitely knows that, let's say you have two like functionally identical applications. One was done within a day or two, has a lot of technical depth, a lot of hard coded stuff. The second one was done, let's call it properly, with some more time and the design and the architecture. It's actually the difference how fast you can implement new features in case you have a lot of technical depth is like significantly different. So it can take days to implement new feature if you have a spaghetti now code, or hours if you have a clean code.
And same to debug. It's not because you mentioned it introduces bugs, but it also makes them harder to debug, to identify and fix.
Exactly, exactly. So that is like one at the end of this part. I have like one of the reasons why to do not use, especially for web users, untitled workflows, which is the default name. Well, the life will be much harder if you do not like properly name the workflows, if you don't use the proper naming convention, etc. So there are a lot of reasons why it's great to have a clean code. And in this part, let me be more specific to VWeb. Previously, it was like the first one was about databases, not related so much about VWeb. The second one was somewhere in between. So security is also on the front end side and the back end side. But for this one, this part, I would want to focus more on VWeb specifics. So, number one, components. So I'm actually not sure like when components were introduced. I am not sure exactly when they
December.
were. December. Oh, okay. So be, before components were introduced, it was absolutely okay not to implement them. But keep in mind that there are like three core reasons why use components, why to have like this atomic component mindset. Like first, it will allow you to be more consistent within the application. Example which I provided is like, for example, the models. Let's say that you have like 10 different models, 20 different models pop-ups within your application, and you don't want to recreate this every time when you are creating a new model. So delete user model, delete event model. So 5 different delete models. You definitely do not want to have it as one. Or you definitely do not want to have it as a separate models or product cards, etc. So if you will stick to this component atomic system or mindset, or how we call it, it allows you to be actually more consistent within the application, and you will not have like 5 different models. And one more thing is that it allows you to make much quicker changes. So you don't need to change something on 5 different places, but you will do just one change within the component.
And I think it's similar to like when you work with global workflows. If you, it's the sign that you should create a global workflow or that you should create a component is when you start doing the same thing multiple times and you're like, I already did that. If you start getting annoyed because you already did something, it's a sign that you should explore
Exactly.
components.
Exactly. And when you like mentioned global workflows related to that global variables, so there are like you, almost every user will use the web variables, and it can get quite messy. Well, suppose that you wouldn't use any components. It can get a bit messy, a lot messy, if you will not use any components, because you will need to store almost all variables as a global variables. So you will have like bunch of variables which you might use only on one page or within one table, or I don't know, like within one context, but it's actually accessible within the entire application, and it doesn't make sense. So this is a second, I would say, the main reason why we always try to have a component based system. It allows you to keep the context within the component, unless you need to expose it. But having a local context, local variables, local actions, and local workflows.
And by the way, this is a development best practice. It's not specific to
Yes,
WeWeb. So it would be the same if you were coding, if you were writing code, it would be the same in other no code tools that are close to the code like we are. It's a programming best practice, a development best practice.
exactly. If you are doing front ends in Vue or React or Angular or any other, and not only web applications, the same apply for mobile applications. Like this component driven development is something that everyone should have in mind, because it will make your life a lot easier. And like the last but not least, also quite important is that in some cases, not always, but in some cases, it can help to improve the performance of the application. So especially if the component, for example, if you are using a product card on 5 different places on the page, if you have it as one component, it's just like the instance is loaded 5 times, but you don't need to load all the styles for that component, all the code for that component 5 times. So in some cases, it might even improve the performance of the application. Cool. I think this is almost the last one. Uh, what do I mean by unifying the business logic? So this applies mainly to formulas, or if you are using JavaScript in the web, or global workflows. Try to use, or let me rephrase. Try to avoid using the same expression multiple times. It's just this try principle. Don't repeat yourself that you should implement everywhere. It's like,
Hmm.
if you Google the basic programming principles, try, do not repeat yourself, is number one. One example was that we can apply it for the components, but we can apply it also for the custom logic. And one thing that I would definitely mention is, I'm not sure if in context of no code if it's the right term, but to use the global evaluators. And let me give you one example. Suppose that on the front end uh, on, you want to modify what user can see based on the subscription that the user has, right? So if the user has premium subscription, he can see more. If he has basic subscription, he can see less. Some some functionalities are not visible, etc. So there is one approach which you can use, which is hard code those conditions. So if the user subscription is this one, then this element or this table or this button or whatever is not visible. Number one, which you do not want to implement, you want to avoid this. Second option would be to, let's call it a global evaluator, which is basically you have one VWeb formula where it will automatically, like, let's say, give you an object of user permission. So what can user do? So you can, and this is an example from one of our internal projects. So in this case, it is an evaluator saying that if user can access features generator, screen generator, database schema generator, what is the maximum projects, etc. So do not implement such logic every time for each, let's say, functionality or different places within the application, but I would recommend to use these global evaluators. Not sure,
Okay, so
maybe
that
Joyce, you have
it,
some other example of this.
it makes me think of the alerts element that we have, where we have one object with lots of different key value pairs, and so instead of having, I don't know, 5 variables related to the alert system, we just have one object variable that allows us to optimize, to customize the alerts based on those. Is that what you mean? Is that what you
Yeah,
had in mind?
that's an example, exactly.
Cool.
Um,
Nice.
or like one more simple example, or more simple example is, let's say you have a variable which is controlling whether some models are visible. So
Mm.
instead of, let's say you have
Yeah.
five different models, well, again, the best practice would be you have five different variables, like, is model A visible? True,
Yeah.
false. Is model B visible? True, false. You have five different variables. Instead, like, unified to one variable, like visible model, which can take different values. It can be
Yeah.
like
Like the
model A,
name of
model
the,
B.
and
Exactly.
if it's open or not. Cool.
Yeah. And the last part is basically quick tips. So what I try to always also emphasize within the team is like how to make your web project clean. Use the proper naming convention. Yeah. So, like, for example, either for workflow names or formula names or something like that, you can use snake case, you can use camel case, you can use a different naming convention, but be consistent. I think that the most important is being consistent in your naming convention. So that's like number one. Number two, which I already mentioned, like this concept of don't repeat yourself. It can be applied to workflows, to formulas, to components. It can be applied everywhere. It's just as you mentioned previously, like when you see something that you are you're executing or you are using multiple times in the application, make it reusable if it makes sense. But more often than not, it makes sense to make it reusable if you use it on different places within the application. And the last one, let's try to avoid this so-called untitled workflow, because I love when, for example, I have an application which I am trying to debug, and I see, okay, there was an error in untitled workflow. Cool. I have no idea where the error happened. So, I mean,
And
it
by
will
the way,
take 2 seconds, 2 more seconds, and it can save you a lot of time.
yeah. And now you can also like document your workflow actions. You can add descriptions to your workflow actions, to the workflow, to your formulas, to your collections. So that again was a feature that was requested a lot because that's a tradition as well. And like people who write code, they will also write comments in their codes. And so
Exactly.
that's our way of trying to introduce comments within WeWeb. It's one of the challenges of no code tools is how can we implement those best documentation best practices that traditional coders already have and how we can integrate them in no code tools. So yeah,
Yes.
I mean that's sorry.
So I think it was added like a few weeks ago,
Yeah,
and
it's
thank you
fairly
so
new
much for this
and
feature. Thank you.
and there's also the new finder. Now you can do Control F or Command F when you're in editing mode to find the variables. That's also with that idea in mind of helping you scale your projects in WeWeb. So making it easier to find where things are used. If there are any variables that are not being used that you can delete to like clean up your project and make it more scalable, cleaner and less spaghetti,
Yeah.
and more scalable.
Yeah. So this was actually quite a lifesaver for one of the projects that we've implemented, which we needed to like redo or remake. So yeah, guys,
But it
everyone,
helped.
you use this.
Jean-Baptiste is saying, thanks for all those tips and info. And Antoine actually had a question. Maybe we can take 5 minutes for questions. We went a little bit long, but I think we started a little bit late. Just so everyone can find you on LinkedIn. You shared here, so don't hesitate to reach out to Europe after this webinar. And I mean, we can probably have you back another time if you're up for it. But let's take a look at
Definitely.
Antoine's question. And if you have other questions, please like drop them quickly in the chat. So Antoine was saying, and I love this question because it happens so often. How do you tell a client that their database needs to be restructured instead of just patching a feature when the DB is poorly designed and not well structured?
Mm-hmm. I always, and it's not only in case of when we need to redesign the database, it's for any rework that we need to do. It's like start with why. So, for example, like any rework needs a why. So, for example, if the database is done improperly, the why can be it's slow, it's harder to or almost difficult or impossible to add new data or create new features. So I always start with why should we actually make those changes, because if you cannot, like, let's be honest, if you cannot find a proper or good reason why there is some rework needed, then I guess the rework is not needed. because like if you are familiar with like best practices and you suggest to rework something, definitely start with why. Like, is it slow? Is it inconsistent? Or what's actually the problem? So this is how we started. When I showed you one example, it was super easy to explain to the client why we needed to do the rework, because we explained that, okay, if you will want to add a new language, you will need like 3 or 4 days of our work to
Mm,
edit, to make those edits on every page of the application and to make database changes. Instead, if we rework it and you will want to add new language, instead of days, it will be like 2 hours or something, or even less.
yeah. And I remember one user. It was a long time ago, but I was working on one of his projects, and at first he didn't want to change anything about the database, and it was fine. But after working with him um, a little bit, he realized as we were building the app, because he wanted some coaching to build his app, and as we were building his app together, he realized like the data is structured in a way that it makes it very difficult to fetch the information you need. We needed to do
Mhm.
joins and stuff like that, and roll-ups and WeWeb and joins in Xano, and it was just even really simple reports were very hard
Yeah.
to put together. And then he was like, okay, it probably makes sense to just restructure now, get a very clean DB now, and then I can, you know, with peace of mind, scale my app.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. So you can get into a lot of troubles.
Yeah. And Antoine is saying, why is indeed the most important. The issue is that they will be reticent in paying for this redesign and prefer a workaround. Thank you. Very useful workshop. You guys rock. Yeah, for sure. And if they're reticent in paying, I think it's just like if you build, sometimes you kind of have to bite the bullet and go with the client's way at the beginning and let them realize it's a tricky balance, I guess, because I guess you encounter that all the time where you agree to do the workaround and then it blows up in their face just like you predicted, and then they blame you. Like we've had I know I've seen several times people where we tell them do not use Airtable for if you want a secure public facing app because it doesn't have control access, and some people say yes, yes, and then 6 months later they're like, you did well, kind of, we told you so. I guess it's finding that right balance between explaining, going with the workaround, and hoping that the client will
And actually, let me give you like two super quick examples. Like, it's not always great to be like super clean within the project. So what do I
mm,
mean by that? So when we were working with a startup, like they wanted to iterate super quickly. Okay, they were absolutely okay that okay, shit will happen. So there will be some bugs. Things might not work always properly, etc. But the speed of getting like the new functionalities and the user experience was the most important one.
yeah,
So in this case, of course, we were also linked to do more workarounds. Example number one. Example number two is that recently we've been working with a Slovak bank. When you are working with a bank, and after the project, they are going to do a penetration testing. So basically, it's a test if your app is secure. Well, in this case, if you are working with a bank, you cannot like afford to make workarounds and quick fixes, etc. You need to start like very clean from the very beginning. So
yeah,
again, the context is important if you are building like super fast iterating startup or if you are building for an enterprise.
yeah. I think it brings us to the question from Prince. Is it better to improve something that works today but could become a problem if the app scales strongly but may never happen? I really like this question because I think it's like entrepreneurship. A lot of people worry about like copyright and intellectual property, and but they have no customers, or musicians who copyright this, and Yeah, sorry.
But I mean, the response is the same that you started,
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
and that is actually, if you Google like the core programming principles, I do not remember how exactly it is phrased, but one of those principles is that, let me rephrase it in a way, that do not implement things you don't need now. Like if you will
Oh,
need
it's
it
the keep it
later.
stupid simple, no? It's not the kiss thing
Keys,
or
keys,
yeah.
exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, I mean, again, the context might be important in this case, but yeah, like don't implement something that you don't need now. If there is a high chance that you will need it tomorrow, okay. If there is like maybe you will need it in 2 years, like forget it
Yeah.
about it. You don't need it.
Yeah. But yeah, in my opinion, but I guess it does depend on the context, but I think it's always better to ship. Security is a different issue. Never compromise on security.
Yeah.
But for the rest, I would say it's better to have something that works today and so that you can test it because you always, the best feedback you can get is from actual users. So
Exactly.
it's better to
Exactly.
have it out there, and even if it's not perfect, even if you need to tweak later. All right. Okay, thank you so much for your time. It was amazing. It was packed. Like Roberto said, it
Thank
was so
you.
packed. You should definitely come again. And I think we can conclude on Roberto's advice to Antoine. Your DB's gonna go boom always works. So, so yeah,
we,
there you go.
we can end up with this one. Yeah. And Joyce, thank you a lot for the invitation and for the chance to talk about it. I mean, it's super interesting topic. So if anyone is interested to have a chat about like the some of the best practices or bad practices, also I'm happy to chat with anyone. So
Cool. Yeah, and
you
I
know
was
my
thinking,
LinkedIn. So
as you were talking, I was thinking we should have you write blog posts as well. That would be amazing. But all right, thank you everyone, and talk to you soon. And have a great rest of your day wherever